Welcome to On This Day on the Gruely True Sports Network. I'm your host for On This Day, Mike Goodpaster, and today we're going to talk about January the 24th, 1982, the Cinderella Super Bowl between the Cincinnati Bengals and the San Francisco 49ers. And this truly was a Cinderella Super Bowl, as the Bengals and 49ers had been terrible the previous few years. The Bengals 1970, 73, 75 had made the playoffs. They just missed the 76 and 77. 78 and 79, 4 and 12 seasons, and then they hired Forrest Gregg, the great Green Bay Packer of the 1960s, to be the head coach. He had had a successful season in Cleveland, where he was actually the coach of the year in the late 70s, and basically they fired him when they didn't get as far as they wanted to in a quick enough time, which would have been something that they would come to regret by giving him to the Bengals. Now, the Bengals' 1981 season was a season that after 1980, the Bengals finished strong. They did lose to the Cleveland Browns at Riverfront Stadium, where the Browns clinched the division. That was the Tom Darden game where he took the cheap shot on McAnally. McAnally comes back in, catches the deep ball down the left side of the end zone, but the Browns rallied to win that game at the end. That was the Cardiac Browns from 1980. The 1981 season started off in Cincinnati, and it was a game where the Bengals trailed 21 to nothing. And Kenny Anderson, the starting quarterback, was benched, and he was replaced by Turk Schonert, who was the third-string quarterback, because Jack Thompson, the throw-in Samoan, the second-string quarterback, was injured. Schonert rallied the Bengals to a 27 to 21 victory. A lot of people in Cincinnati were calling for Anderson to be benched and for Schonert or Thompson to be the starter the next week in New York. But Forrest Gregg decided to go with Kenny Anderson, and Anderson had one of the best games of his career, beating the Jets at Shea Stadium 31 to 30. And this was a Jets team with the New York Stock Exchange that would end up going on to the playoffs. Now, the Bengals the next week lost to the Cleveland Browns 20 to 17 at home. They followed that up with a huge win over the Buffalo Bills, who they would eventually rematch in divisional playoffs. Jim Breach kicked an overtime field goal to win the game for the Bengals. The Bengals then lost to the Houston Oilers 17 to 10. They were 3 and 2, and they just looked like they'd improved. It didn't look like a Super Bowl season was coming. They beat the Baltimore Colts 41 to 19 and followed that up with a 34 to 7 blowout of the Pittsburgh Steelers. They then got upset by the New Orleans Saints 17 to 7 by George Rogers, who played a great game against them, and all of a sudden the Bengals were 5 and 3 halfway through the season. This is when things got interesting. The Bengals then blew out the Oilers. They went to San Diego and surprised a lot of people by dominating the Chargers 40 to 17. Then they beat the Rams, Broncos, and Browns. That led to the first matchup with the San Francisco 49ers, where the Bengals, while down 7 to 3, I think it was, Kenny Anderson got hurt, came out of the game. Niners beat the Bengals 21 to 3. The next week, the Bengals clinched the AFC Central Division Championship with a 17 to 10 win at Pittsburgh. Followed that up with a 30 to 28 win over the Atlanta Falcons to get home field advantage throughout the playoffs. Now, when you get to the playoffs, the Bengals started off with the Buffalo Bills, and the Bills were a really good team, and the Bills were a team that would have been capable of going to the Super Bowl also. The Bengals beat them 28 to 21, and a big play of that game was on a 4th and 8. Quarterback Joe Ferguson completed a pass for an apparent first down. But there was a penalty flag on the play, and it was a delay of game because the Bills had a hard time getting a call in from the sideline, and the play took longer than it should have. That led to the AFC Championship game, the coldest game in the history of the NFL. 59 below was the wind chill at game time, and the Bengals dominated the San Diego Chargers 27 to 7. Now, I know a lot of people think that the Bengals won that game just because, for lack of a better term, the game was played more in Bengals weather. But if you remember, in November, in 80-degree weather, the Bengals would beat the Chargers worse at 40 to 17. So the Bengals would advance to their first Super Bowl ever. Now, on the 49ers side, same thing. 1980, they'd been a little bit better. The turning point for the 1981 team was the 1981 draft, where in the first round they selected cornerback Ronnie Lott out of USC. And then in the second round, they got Eric Wright, who was a cornerback, Carlton Williams, who was a strong safety. You get 3/4 of the starting defensive backfield in one draft. And all of a sudden, this team was a little bit different. Now, the head coach of this team was Bill Walsh. And Bill Walsh was the guy who, of course, invented the West Coast offense. But a lot of people don't notice it was invented in 1970 in Cincinnati when Greg Cook goes down. Virgil Carter, who did not have a strong arm comes in. And they basically developed this offense to make up for the lack of arm strength. And Bill Walsh in 1975 thought he should have gotten a head coaching job when Paul Brown stepped down. He didn't. He got mad. He left. He became the head coach at Stanford and then eventually got the 49ers job, where the first couple of years were really rough. The 1981 season started off in Detroit against Billy Sims at the Pontiac Silverdome. And if you go through the first 3 weeks of the season, you think that this 49ers team's no different than any other. They lost that season opener 24-17. Came back, beat the Bears 28-17, got blown out by the Atlanta Falcons in Atlanta 34-17. But from here on, from September 27th all the way through the Super Bowl, they only lost one game, and that was a game in mid-November to the Cleveland Browns that they lost 15-12. They blew out the Dallas Cowboys 45-14. They beat the Rams twice, and this was a team that was hitting on all cylinders by the time you get to midseason. They beat the Bengals 21-3, and then you go to the playoffs, and they beat the New York Giants 38-24 against, of course, a rookie Lawrence Taylor, who ended up being the greatest linebacker for my money in NFL history. And then you get the catch game in 1981, the NFC Championship game, and it was red right tight, sprint right option. It'll also be remembered as just simply the catch. And the primary receiver was Freddie Solomon. Dwight Clark was lined up on the right. Montana was supposed to roll to his right and find Solomon. Clark's pattern called for him to cut left across the end zone, stop, and immediately verse his path to the right. If Solomon was covered, it would be up to Montana to find Clark. Due to the pressure, Montana's pass was high, but Clark made the catch. A lot of people forget that there were still 51 seconds left, and the Cowboys get the ball at midfield. They complete a pass, and a game-saving tackle is made, or they would have lost this game. And this was the birth of basically a dynasty. And a lot of people, when they talk about Joe Montana, they talk about all the weapons he had with Jerry Rice and Roger Craig. There was no Jerry Rice or Roger Craig in Super Bowl XVI. And the rushing attack, I don't even think the leading rusher for the 49ers had more than 500 yards during the season. So they go to the Super Bowl in Pontiac, Michigan, on this day, January 24th, 1982. The game time start was 4 o'clock. And get this, from what I remember of this game, the pregame show was only an hour and a half. And you had a halftime show up with people. The 49ers come out and take a 20-0 lead. And the key was the 49ers had discovered that a ball kicked along the ground at the Pontiac Silverdome was hard to handle. And they kicked off to the Bengals on the ground with a 14-0 lead with less than a minute left in the first half. The Bengals fumbled and bumbled the ball. The 49ers recovered it, kicked a field goal. They kicked the same kick again in the last seconds of the half. The Bengals fumbled it again. It's a 20-0 game. The Bengals then come out and controlled the entire second half. They scored a touchdown to make it 20-7. And then at 20-7, the key point of this game is the Bengals get first and goal. And they run the ball a couple times. They throw a pass to Charles Alexander, which is caught at the 1, and he's tackled. And on 4th and goal at the 1, the Bengals attempted to run the ball in with their big fullback, Pete Johnson, who usually weighed somewhere north of 270 pounds. And it didn't work. The play was called 46-7 lead, and the big problem was Bengals wide receiver David Verser lined up on the wrong side of the formation, didn't give them the numbers they expected to have, and they got stopped. The 49ers come back. They score a touchdown. The Bengals score another one. And Dan Ross had one of the great games any tight ends ever had in the Super Bowl, but the Bengals fell short 26-21. Now, these two franchises, because of the two Super Bowls they played in the 80s, kind of went separate directions. The San Francisco 49ers in 1982 did not make the playoffs. They went 3-6 in a strike-shortened season, one of the few teams that didn't get in the 8-team tournament in the NFC. In the AFC, the Bengals were the number 3 seed. They went 7-2. They were the only team to beat the LA Raiders that year, who went 8-1. But they got overtaken in the playoffs by the 6-3 New York Jets, who pounded them 44-17 behind 200 yards of rushing from Freeman McNeil. The Bengals then, 83 through 87, no playoff berths. The Redskins were back in the championship game in 83, won the Super Bowl in 84, won it again in 1988 against the Bengals, then again in 1989. So what you had was the birth of a dynasty with the 1981 season with the 49ers. The Bengals, all through the 80s, were a solid franchise, but never could get over the hump, including that Super Bowl 23, where they fell 30-some seconds short of being the world champions. So on this day, January 24th, 1982, the San Francisco 49ers win their first of many Super Bowls, defeating the Cincinnati Bengals 26-21. All right, guys, you've been listening to On This Day on the Grueling Truth Sports Network. Make sure you follow us at Twitter, at Grueling Truth. You can hear all of our shows on iHeartRadio, iTunes, TuneIn, Spreaker, Stitcher, Spotify. Wherever you find sports podcasts, you'll find the Grueling Truth. So for now, I'm Mike Goodpaster. You've been listening to the Grueling Truth, where the legends speak.